On the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, the streets looked calm in the early morning light. Neatly cut lawns stretched in front of brick homes, and children's bicycles leaned against fences, as if life here had always been predictable. The air carried the smell of fresh asphalt from a street recently patched up, mixing with the faint sweetness of blooming jasmine along the sidewalks. At first glance, nothing about this place suggested trouble. It was the kind of neighborhood where people nodded politely to one another, where the hum of sprinklers or the barking of a distant dog were the loudest interruptions to peace. Yet, under that surface, something was uneasy, like a floorboard that looked solid but shifted when you stepped on it. Marcus lived here, tucked into the corner lot where the sun fell evenly across his driveway every morning. He was the kind of man who carried himself with quiet confidence, neither boastful nor withdrawn. His Jeep sat parked proudly out front, polished and steady like him, a machine built for challenges, but sitting idle in a place where the biggest argument might be about the length of a hedge. Marcus had built a steady life, one defined by hard work and calm choices. Neighbors often saw him heading off early, coffee in hand, a nod on his way out. He wasn't the loudest presence in the neighborhood, but he was noticed, if only because of how steady he seemed. Beneath that calm rhythm, though, there were cracks. The Homeowners Association had its rules, and while most people didn't think much of them, Marcus felt the weight of their gaze more than most. Some saw him not as a man, but as a subject under constant review. His Jeep, for instance, wasn't just a vehicle to them. It was a violation, an object they claimed clashed with the aesthetic standards of their picture-perfect streets. On paper, it seemed small, the sort of rule that CE would be argued or overlooked. But in practice, it had become something heavier, a quiet struggle of control and resentment. The HOA board was run by people who thrived on that control. Among them was a woman whose name didn't need repeating for everyone to know who she was. She walked with the air of someone who believed the rules were her armor, someone who spoke as if her word was law. To outsiders, she looked like any other neighbor. Neat hair, pressed clothes, and an air of authority carried in every step. But those who lived here knew her tone, sharp and dismissive, especially when speaking to those she didn't respect. Her eyes always seemed to linger on Marcus longer than they should, as though his very presence challenged the world she wanted to control. Still, the neighborhood appeared normal to anyone passing through. Children played ball in driveways. Couples watered their flowers. Lawn chairs sat on porches, waiting for quiet evenings. Marcus lived in this rhythm too, smiling when spoken to, keeping his home in perfect order. Yet behind closed doors, he sometimes sat in silence, staring out at his Jeep under the glow of the streetlight, feeling the weight of eyes he couldn't see. It wasn't fear exactly, but something else, an awareness that he had been marked, singled out for reasons that went deeper than property rules. When the letters came from the HOA, folded neatly and left in his mailbox, they looked harmless enough. A warning, then a demand, each one dressed in formal language about regulations and obligations. But Marcus knew the intent went beyond paper. These weren't reminders, they were challenges, tests of how far he could be pushed. He tossed the first letter aside, choosing peace over confrontation. The second, though, he read twice, the words pressing into his mind like cold fingers. The language was sharper, edged with a threat that wasn't written outright, but felt clear all the same. And in that atmosphere, one of order stretched too tightly, of quiet power wielded by those who fed on it, the seeds of something darker began to grow. Marcus sensed it in the way voices hushed when he passed, in the way meetings dragged on with stares that landed on him more often than anyone else. Life in the neighborhood carried on, but beneath it, lines were being drawn. The crime, when it finally came, would not begin with violence or chaos. It would begin in silence, in the quiet approval of those who mistook rules for justice. It would come from people who cloaked themselves in authority they did not have, people who believed fear could bend a man to their will. Marcus didn't know it yet, but the calm of his mornings, angs, the simple sound of sprinklers and birdsong was about to fracture, and when it did, the truth of who held real power here would be laid bare in the most unexpected way. The first real spark came on a hot afternoon when Marcus returned from work to find a note taped to his front door. The handwriting wasn't official, not the neat printed letters of an HOA form. It was rushed, uneven, and angry. Remove the vehicle or else. No signature, no explanation. The paper fluttered against the wood in the light breeze, but the message burned into him. For a moment he just stood there, keys in hand, staring at it. The Jeep was parked exactly where it had always been, no different than the pickups and SUVs in the driveways around him. But to whoever left that note, it was something more, something that needed to be erased. The next HOA meeting confirmed his suspicion. Karen, the board president, stood at the head of the table in the clubhouse, reading from a stack of papers like scripture. Her voice carried the weight of someone who thrived on control. "Our neighborhood must uphold certain standards," she declared, her eyes flicking toward Marcus. "Standards that keep property values high and ensure we remain the kind of community we all agreed to be part of." She never said his name, but everyone knew. The Jeep had become a symbol, a wedge driven between him and the people who pretended to be his neighbors. He sat quietly, jaw tight, listening to their words dressed in civility, but sharpened with malice. Each sentence made it clearer that this wasn't about rules. It was about him, his independence, his unwillingness to bow. And beneath the forced politeness, he felt the weight of resentment building like pressure under stone. Things began to shift after that meeting. Neighbors who once waved now avoided his eyes. Conversations stopped when he walked by. Even the children who used to play near his yard were called inside sooner, as if something about him had become dangerous by association. Marcus noticed, and though he said nothing, he carried it with him. In the evenings, sitting on his porch, he felt the stairs, invisible but heavy, as though his presence alone had become a threat to the illusion of order the HOA tried to maintain. The tension didn't just come from the outside. Inside his home, Marcus wrestled with his own thoughts. He told himself he could ignore it, that giving in to anger would only give them what they wanted. But the more he thought about the note on his door, the letters in his mailbox, the whispers at meetings, the harder it became to stay silent. He wasn't just being targeted for a vehicle. He was being targeted for who he was. And while he had lived his life with quiet strength, there was only so much pushing a man could take before something inside him shifted. Karen, meanwhile, had her own reasons for pushing harder. She wasn't driven only by rules. Her need for control was rooted in fear. Fear of losing the grip she had on the neighborhood, fear of being seen as weak. To her, Marcus represented defiance, a challenge she couldn't ignore. And behind her sharp words was something darker, something unspoken. She saw in him a presence she couldn't bend, and that gnawed at her more than she'd admit. Her obsession with order grew into an obsession with him, twisted not by admiration, but by the need to dominate. The board fed into it too. A few members whispered their agreement in private, but when Karen spoke, they nodded along. No one wanted to be on her bad side. Their silence became complicity. Each nod, another stone, laid in the wall, being built around Marcus. And came the fines. Slips of paper left in his mailbox with numbers that grew each week, demands for payment tied to violations. Marcus tore them in half, tossing them into the trash, his patience fraying. It wasn't just money they wanted. It was a submission. The more he resisted, the more creative they became. Someone left garbage bags on his lawn one morning. Another time he came home to find a scratch down the side of his Jeep, deliberate and cruel. He filed reports, but nothing came of them. The police shrugged it off as neighborhood disputes. To Marcus, it was proof he was on his own. At the same time, Cracks in Karen's perfect image began to show. She spoke of rules and standards, but behind closed doors, she was drowning in debt. Her husband had left her years before, tired of the constant need for control, and her finances never recovered. The HOA had become her empire, the one place where she could dictate, command, and feel powerful. Her obsession with Marcus wasn't only about the Jeep, it was about her crumbling sense of authority. If she couldn't control him, then what did she have left? The weeks stretched on, and the atmosphere in the neighborhood thickened with unspoken tension. Marcus carried himself the same way he always had, calm and steady, but inside, he felt the slow boil of anger and disbelief. His friends outside the neighborhood told him to move, to leave the pettiness behind, but this was his home, bought with his own hard work, and he refused to be pushed out. Each night, as he sat looking at the Jeep, he thought about the principle of it. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about dignity, about not letting anyone strip away what he had earned. The turning point came one evening when he heard footsteps outside his window. Peering through the blinds, he saw two men in cheap security uniforms walking across his lawn, flashlights cutting through the dark. Their badges glinted, but something about them was off, their movements too sloppy, their tone too casual as they muttered to each other. Marcus stepped outside, asking what they were doing. One of them smirked, waving a clipboard. "Routine check," he said. But Marcus knew better. The HOA had no authority to send security, and these men didn't look like professionals. When he pressed them, their act faltered, and they walked off quickly, leaving behind a chill that settled into his bones. It was the first real sign that this wasn't going to stop with fines and notes. They were pushing further, testing how far they could go, and as Marcus watched them disappear into the night, he felt something inside him harden. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was war, and whether he wanted it or not, it was coming closer every day. The night it all came to a head was heavy with heat, the kind of sticky summer air that clung to skin and slowed breath. Marcus had fallen into the habit of keeping his lights low, blinds drawn, knowing too well that eyes were always on him. But tonight felt different. The silence of the neighborhood wasn't peaceful. It was loaded, like a held breath waiting to snap. Even the cicadas outside seemed louder, their relentless song cutting into the darkness. It began with the sound of tires on asphalt, too deliberate, too slow. Marcus, sitting at the edge of his couch with a half-empty glass of water in hand, froze. Through the slit in his blinds, he caught the faint glow of headlights inching down the street. The vehicle stopped directly in front of his house. A door slammed, then another. Voices murmured, low and muffled, but with an edge too. That didn't sound like neighbors. 3 men appeared in his driveway, dressed in dark uniforms with badges that glinted under the streetlight. Fake cops, the same kind he had caught before, only now they carried themselves with bolder intent. Their shoulders squared, their flashlights slicing across his yard like they already owned it. One of them raised a bullhorn, crackling with static, and barked out, "This is the Homeowners Association Enforcement Division. You are in violation of community codes. Step outside immediately." Marcus felt his heart hammer against his ribs. Enforcement Division? There was no such thing. They weren't here to talk. He could see it in the way one of them rested his hand near a holster, in the smirk plastered across another's face. They weren't bluffing anymore. They had come to break him. He stood in the center of his living room, his breath shallow, his mind running in jagged bursts. Should he call the police? He already knew how that would go. They'd shrug, file a report, maybe even laugh it off as a neighborhood spat. No, this was different. This was immediate. These men weren't just pretending. They were ready to act. The bullhorn crackled again. "Final warning. Step outside, or we'll remove you by force." Marcus gritted his teeth, rage rising to meet the fear. They wanted him to bow, to walk out trembling, to let them drag him across his own lawn like a criminal. Not tonight. He stepped toward the door, his hand hovering over the knob, when another sound split through the night. The sharp crunch of boots against gravel, moving fast, in sync. Not 3 men. Not neighbors. More. Out of the shadows emerged 6 figures, their movements clean and coordinated, their presence undeniable. Former Navy SEALs, Marcus's brothers, men he had served alongside years ago. He hadn't called them, hadn't asked for backup, but word travelled in their circle. They knew when one of their own was being cornered. And tonight, they had arrived. The fake cops froze, their swagger faltering as the 6 men closed in. No words were needed. The difference between play-acting authority and carrying real power was stark. The SEALs' eyes were sharp, their posture steady, each one a wall of quiet, controlled force. "Take the uniforms off," one of them said flatly, his voice cutting through the night. One of the imposters stammered, trying to bluff. "We're conducting official business." He didn't get to finish. In a blur of motion, one SEAL had him pinned against the hood of his own car, the air knocked out of him. Another stripped the clipboard from the second man's hand, snapping it in half before tossing it aside like trash. The third tried to run, but 2 more intercepted him, dragging him down hard against the curb. The night erupted into chaos. Grunts, shouts, the scrape of boots against pavement. Marcus stood frozen at the doorway, watching as the illusion of control shattered in front of him. These weren't enforcers. They were cowards in costume, unraveling the second real strength stood against them. Karen appeared then, her heels clacking across the street, her voice shrill with fury. She had come to watch, to savor what she thought would be Marcus's humiliation. But when she saw the scene, her hired men writhing on the ground under the weight of true fighters, her face drained of color. She shouted, pointing, insisting they had the right, that Marcus was in violation. Her words grew desperate, spitting out excuses, demands, anything to salvage control. No one listened. Marcus stepped outside, finally, the night air hitting his face like a wave. He walked past Karen without a word, his eyes locked on the men who had tried to terrorize him. One SEAL looked back at him, nodding, as if to say, "It's your call." For a moment, Marcus stood there, torn between anger and restraint. He could feel the weight of months of harassment pressing down, all the notes, the scratches on his Jeep, the whispers, the humiliation. He wanted to lash out, to finally break free of it. But he also felt the heavy truth of what stood before him. If he gave in to violence now, they would win in another way. They would drag him down with them. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice calm but sharp as glass. "You come to my house again, pretending to be something you're not, and I promise you, you won't walk away." The imposters looked up at him, faces twisted with fear now instead of arrogance. Karen's voice cracked as she tried to shout over him, but her authority had collapsed in the dirt along with her enforcers. Police sirens wailed in the distance, someone finally having called in the noise. The SEALs released the men, pushing them toward the flashing lights that were fast approaching. When the real officers arrived, they found imposters in fake uniforms, a woman screeching about community codes, and 6 calm veterans standing firm beside their brother. The scene burned itself into Marcus's memory, the flashing red and blue lights painting the quiet houses, the imposters cuffed and shoved into patrol cars, Karen shrieking until she was silenced with threats of obstruction charges. It was the night the balance of power snapped, when the fragile illusion of control collapsed under the weight of reality. For Marcus, it was more than survival. It was vindication. The moment he realized he wasn't alone, that strength didn't come from rules on paper or fake uniforms, but from truth and the people who stood with him. Yet even in that victory, the adrenaline left him trembling. The danger had been real, closer than he wanted to admit. He knew if his brothers hadn't arrived when they did, the night might have ended very differently. The crime wasn't just the attempted eviction or the fake authority. The real crime was the sickness that had festered in the neighborhood, the obsession with control that pushed people to cross lines they never should have touched. And as the sirens faded and the street grew quiet again, Marcus stood in the center of it all, knowing this was only the beginning of the reckoning that would follow. The neighborhood did not look the same the next morning. The sun rose over streets that had once seemed safe, ordinary, and calm, but the illusion had been torn apart. Police tape still fluttered where the imposters had been dragged into patrol cars. Tire marks scarred the asphalt, and whispers travelled faster than the morning paper. People who had once stayed silent now peeked through blinds and traded stories in hushed voices. No one could ignore it anymore. The battle that had always been hidden beneath HOA newsletters and fine notices had exploded into something that could not be buried. For Karen, the aftermath was humiliation. She had stood on the street screaming like a woman possessed, only to be ignored, dismissed, and finally threatened with arrest. That image, her face red, her voice cracking, her authority in shambles, spread quickly. Phones had been out that night, recording everything. Within hours, clips appeared online. "Fake cops try to evict black homeowner," the titles screamed. In the videos, Karen's voice cut through like nails on glass, her words unraveling under the weight of her own obsession. What she once held as power had become a performance, and the world saw her not as a leader, but as a tyrant drunk on control. The HOA board scrambled to contain the fallout. Some members distanced themselves, claiming they had no knowledge of Karen's actions, while others quietly resigned, unwilling to face the storm. But their attempts rang hollow. Too many neighbors had seen the truth with their own eyes. The board had turned into Karen's personal weapon, and now its credibility was gone. Marcus sat in his living room, blinds drawn once again, but this time not out of fear. The adrenaline had drained from his body, leaving behind exhaustion that sank into his bones. His phone buzzed endlessly, calls from reporters, from friends, from strangers who wanted to call him a hero. He ignored most of them. He hadn't asked for this spotlight. He hadn't wanted to be the symbol of defiance or the man who stood against the HOA. All he wanted was to live in peace, to keep his home, to drive his Jeep without being treated like an enemy. But peace no longer felt simple. It had been shattered, and now the world was watching. His brothers, the SEALs who had arrived in his darkest moment, checked in on him the next day. They sat in his kitchen, their presence filling the space with quiet strength. "You did the right thing," one of them told him. But Marcus wasn't sure. He replayed the night in his mind, over and over. The fake cops stepping into his yard, the bullhorn, the smirks, the way Karen's eyes had burned with triumph before it all collapsed. If his brothers hadn't come, what would have happened? He didn't want to imagine it, but the thought lingered, leaving him restless. Karen, meanwhile, drowned in denial. She told anyone who would listen that she had only been upholding the rules, that Marcus was the one who had provoked it all. In her mind, she was the victim, betrayed by neighbors who turned on her, abandoned by a board that refused to stand firm. But her voice no longer carried the weight it once did. Where she had once been feared, she was now mocked. People avoided her in grocery aisles. Children whispered about her in the street. Her control, her reputation, her power, all of it had crumbled. The imposters faced the law head-on. Charges of impersonating officers and trespassing landed heavily on them. Their mugshots appeared in local papers, faces once smug, now blank and tired. They claimed Karen had promised them it was legal, that they were hired for community security. Their excuses painted her deeper into the mess, each statement another nail in the coffin of her credibility. She tried to push back, to deny involvement, but texts surfaced, payments traced. The truth tightened around her like a noose. For the wider community, the event split them open. Some felt ashamed, realizing how silence had fed Karen's obsession. They had watched Marcus endure the fines, the whispers, the harassment, and had done nothing. Others doubled down, insisting rules were rules, and Marcus should have just complied. Those voices were quieter now, drowned out by the undeniable violence of what had happened. But they still lingered, proving that even after such a dramatic night, prejudice and control did not vanish. Media swarmed in, reporters eager to spin the story. Headlines cast Marcus as a man who stood his ground, a symbol of dignity in the face of tyranny. His jeep became more than a vehicle. It became the image of resistance. But fame felt hollow to him. He never wanted to be a symbol. Each time he saw his name in print, or his image flashed on a screen, it only reminded him of the weight he carried, the fear he had lived with, the quiet humiliation of being singled out in his own neighborhood. The psychological toll ran deep. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams of flashlights and bullhorns. He replayed the sound of boots in gravel, the thud of bodies hitting pavement, the way the imposter's eyes shifted from arrogance to fear. And beneath it all was the ache of betrayal. Neighbors who had watched, who had whispered, who had let it get this far without stepping in. His family, those who lived outside the neighborhood, worried constantly. His sister called daily, her voice sharp with both anger and fear. "You should leave, Marcus. Sell the house. Don't give them another chance." But leaving felt like surrender, and Marcus wasn't ready to hand over what he had worked for. Still, the question gnawed at him. Could he ever really be at peace here again? Karen's fall grew darker by the day. As her name spread across the news, she isolated herself, blinds drawn, phone ignored. She wrote long emails to anyone who would read them, justifying her actions, insisting she was right. Her words read more like rants, each one exposing the cracks in her mind. Guilt never touched her, not in the way it should have. Instead, she clung to denial, convinced she was the only one who saw clearly, even as her empire turned to dust. The neighborhood itself would never go back to what it was. The clubhouse where meetings once echoed with rules and codes now stood mostly empty. Attendance dropped. The board struggled to find replacements. The air carried a quiet tension, neighbors glancing at one another with suspicion, wondering who had known what, who had supported Karen in silence, who had cheered her downfall. The sense of community was gone, replaced by something fractured and fragile. Marcus knew he had won, at least on paper. The imposters were arrested. Karen's grip had broken. His jeep sat in the driveway without another note or scratch. But victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like survival, like crawling out of a storm that had left him drenched and scarred. He understood now that power wasn't always about laws or titles. Sometimes it was about who was willing to stand and who was willing to break another person just to feel strong. And as the days turned into weeks, Marcus carried both relief and weariness. He had faced down the worst of it, but he also knew the truth. The kind of hatred that had fueled Karen and her imposters didn't vanish with arrests or humiliation. It lived on, quiet, waiting. The aftermath was not peace. It was reckoning, and it had left its mark on everyone touched by that night. When the dust finally settled, the story of Marcus and the fake HOA cops had already spread far beyond the quiet boundaries of that neighborhood. It had become more than a local scandal. It was a case study, debated on news panels, dissected in community forums, shared endlessly online. People saw in it what they wanted. Some saw it as a triumph of resilience, others as proof of corruption hidden in plain sight. For Marcus, though, it was not a headline or a lesson. It was his life, forever altered by the night power and obsession collided on his front lawn. The legal system moved slowly, but the outcomes were clear. The three imposters faced felony charges for impersonating officers, trespassing, and attempted coercion. Their lawyers painted them as men misled by Karen, desperate for money, lured into something they didn't fully understand. The court wasn't sympathetic. Each of them received prison time, though the sentences varied depending on their level of involvement. Their mugshots became symbols of cowardice, uniforms stripped away, bravado gone. Karen's fall was more complicated. She was charged with conspiracy, harassment, and misuse of HOA funds, payments she had funneled quietly to hire the imposters. The case drew out months of hearings, each one exposing the layers of her obsession, her financial ruin, her desperate grasp for control. Neighbors who once nodded along with her at meetings now testified against her. Even those who had stayed silent before came forward, guilt pressing on them until they could no longer deny the truth. Karen, who had once commanded rooms with her sharp tongue and iron will, now sat small and silent at the defense table. The verdict was inevitable, guilty on multiple counts. She didn't receive decades in prison, but the sentence was heavy enough to strip away the last remnants of her authority. Her home went into foreclosure. Her reputation, once carefully cultivated, became a cautionary tale. The woman who had once enforced rules to the letter became a symbol of corruption and obsession, unchecked. Marcus, meanwhile, faced his own form of reckoning. He was never on trial, never accused of wrongdoing, but the spotlight left scars of its own. Reporters never stopped calling. His name, once private, became attached to a story bigger than him. People praised him as a man who stood tall, who refused to bend, who inspired others to challenge unfair power. Strangers sent letters, some thanking him, others pouring their own stories of harassment and discrimination onto his shoulders. He appreciated it, but he also felt the weight. He hadn't asked to carry their struggles. He hadn't asked to be anyone's hero. Life in the neighborhood never recovered. Some houses went up for sale, families moving away from the stigma of being that community. Others stayed, but lived in the shadow of what had happened, their barbecues and small talk always circling back to the night fake cops came to Marcus's door. The HOA was gutted, rebuilt under new leadership, stripped of much of its power. Rules were softened, meetings grew sparse, and for many, the idea of community oversight was poisoned forever. For Marcus, the house remained both a victory and a scar. Each time he parked his Jeep in the driveway, he felt a quiet sense of triumph, a reminder that he had not been broken. Yet he also felt the ghosts of the struggle, the notes, the scratches, the bullhorn at night. His porch, once a place of peace, still carried echoes of the fear that had once lived there. He stayed, not because it was easy, but because leaving would have meant giving them the last word. On a broader scale, the case forced conversations about power, race, and the thin lines between authority and abuse. Commentators noted how quickly people had rallied behind fake uniforms, how easily the illusion of power could be weaponized against someone who refused to conform. Questions were raised about the role of HOAs, about the unchecked authority of small boards that often acted with more zeal than fairness. Lawmakers in some states even proposed reforms, citing Marcus's case as proof that the system could be twisted into something dangerous. But beyond the legal and political ripples, the story lingered because it touched something deeper, the fragile balance of morality and power in human behavior. Karen's downfall wasn't born in a moment. It grew over years of obsession, of feeding on control until it consumed her. The imposters didn't wake up villains. They were pulled by greed, by weakness, by the willingness to put on a uniform and pretend, as long as it gave them power over someone else. And Marcus, though he emerged stronger, was also changed. He carried the truth that standing firm often comes with a cost, that dignity defended is rarely won without scars. Justice, in the end, was served in the legal sense. The guilty were punished, reputations destroyed, systems questioned. But justice in the deeper sense, the restoration of peace, the healing of trust, was more complicated. Marcus would never look at his neighbors the same way again. Those who had stayed silent bore their own quiet shame. And Karen, even behind bars, likely still believed she had been right all along. The story wasn't about a Jeep or an HOA rulebook. It was about power, who holds it, how it's wielded, and what happens when it becomes an obsession. It was about the human need to feel in control, even at the expense of someone else's dignity. And it was about resistance, the quiet refusal to bow, even when the odds feel impossible. As Marcus looked out at his driveway one late evening, the street quiet again, the air carrying nothing more than the hum of cicadas, he thought about everything that had been lost and everything that had been won. His home was still his. His Jeep still stood where it belonged. His life, though altered, was still his own. That was enough. But the story, his story, was no longer just his. It was out in the world, a reminder that power unchecked always finds its reckoning, and that even in the smallest corners of suburban streets, the struggle for dignity and justice plays out in ways that reveal the very core of who we are.